people in the 18th century were eating. And but when you're baking bread, you're baking it in large quantities. You're making enough bread for your family to eat for the whole week. And there's a sort of a mystery and an art and a science to baking bread. If anybody's been baking bread at home, especially during the last year, experimenting with sourdough, and you might know that, it doesn't always work out quite the way you think it's going to. But, so I have here reproductions of 3 early American cookbooks. This one is actually a British cookbook that was very popular in the colonies. This is Hannah Glass. And then we have Amelia Sennon's American Cookery, considered to be the first American cookbook. And then this is from 1833. This is Lydia Maria Child's The American Frugal Housewife. And it's interesting in looking through these books, particularly here's Hannah Glass, with pages and pages and pages of recipes about everything, but very little actually about baking bread. And we're assuming that it's because this is something that they assumed that you already know how to bake decent bread. Or if you're living in an urban area, well, then you've got access to a bakery where you can go and get bread. But one of the things that's really interesting is the quantity of bread that they're baking. As you're going to see as we bake with the bake oven here, it takes a lot of fuel to get it heated up, and it has a large capacity. You can fit a lot of it in there. So when you're baking for the week, and you're baking a lot. One of the things that we don't have here at the Wentworth house is a dough trough. And the dough trough is a box that they're very often about this wide and about that long and about this wide. And you might almost think, well, what is that, some sort of a cradle with no rocker on it? But no, it's a dough trough, and it's for mixing up the quantity of dough that you need to make the amount of bread that you need. So here's something that Hannah Glass has to say, and this is about to make white bread after the London way. And this will give you a hint about the quantity of ingredients. Take a bushel of the finest flour well dressed, put it in the kneading trough, which means the dough trough, at one end. Take a gallon of water, which we call liquor, and some yeast, doesn't tell you how much, just some yeast. Stir it into the liquor till it looks of a good brown color and begins to curdle. Strain and mix it with your flour till it's about the thickness of a seed cake. Then cover it with the lid of the trough, because a dough trough usually has a lid. And let it stand 3 hours. And as soon as you see it begin to fall, take a gallon more liquor. Weigh 3/4 pound of salt, and with your hands mix it well, etc., etc., etc. So you're talking about large quantities of dough. And Lydia Maria Child in 1833. This is sort of words of reassurance to anyone who's struggling with baking bread at home. It is more difficult to give rules for making bread than for anything else. It depends so much on judgment and experience. So keep trying. Eventually it'll come out all right. And you have to remember that the colonial housewife would have been baking bread in the kitchen from the time she was a tiny tot. Helping mother in the kitchen. So it would become almost instinctive. Okay, so those are some words of reassurance for all you bakers out there. Okay, so today we're going to be making a loaf of bread, or actually a couple of loaves of bread. And in the 18th century, common people often ate bread that was a mix of flours. The wealthier types would eat white bread. White bread was more expensive. But this is more like what ordinary people would have eaten. And it is a mix of cornmeal, which was referred to as Indian. So if you read an old recipe and they talk about add in so much Indian, they're talking about cornmeal. A mix of rye and a mix of wheat flour. From what I've read, apparently wheat doesn't grow very well in New England. So New Englanders in particular often ate other kinds of grains, such as Indian cornmeal, rye, barley, other things. So this is a mix. And we started last night making what's called a sponge. And this is the sponge right here. And the sponge is a mix of the cornmeal that was scalded, mixed with hot water. And then there's some rye flour in there, and then of course the yeast. So this has been working for at least a good 12 hours. So a lot of early a lot of early bread recipes talk about make your sponge the night before. So this is what we did. We made the sponge the night before. And so now we're going to be adding it to this mix of wheat flour and rye flour. So here's the cornmeal with some rye flour and the yeast, which has been working, and it smells very yeasty. As you can see, it's very wet right now. I may do a lot of mixing right in this bowl. So-called kneading. We're going to add some more rye flour. All right, fingers crossed again. We've mixed our dough and added some additional flour, not too much. And then you see this is a very wet kind of a dough. And so we're going to put it into our ceramic pie pans that are buttered here, and then set it aside for 2 hours to rise. Bloop. So now we need to set these in a warm place, probably somewhere near the hearth, to rise for 2 hours. Just as with a modern oven, our brick oven needs preheating, but this isn't as simple as pushing a button to set the thermostat or to set the oven temperature. In the case of the brick oven, a fire is built directly inside the bake oven, first towards the front, and then later it's pushed deeper inside, and it's allowed to burn for approximately 2 hours. And what you're doing is you're heating the bricks. Brick oven baking is baking using the retained heat because the bricks will continue to release heat over a matter of many hours. It's another reason why, if you're using the brick bake oven, you're planning a quantity of baking because you want to make sure that you're making good use of your fuel and all the heat that's inside the bake oven. Let's see. When the oven has reached the desired temperature, all the embers and the coals are swept out, and the oven is closed for a few minutes to allow the heat to build up, and that's called soaking the oven. Okay, it doesn't have anything to do with water, it's to allow the heat to soak in evenly into the bricks. So, how could a housewife tell if the oven was hot enough? There are a couple of different methods that they would use that are referred to in the housekeeping manuals. First of all, there is something called brightening. When the oven has brightened, which means that basically the soot has all burned off and the coals inside are white. Did I say coals? I meant to say the walls of the bake oven are white. And an example of that is over here in the fireplace. Earlier today we had the fire burning in the corner of the fireplace. And you can see that the shape of that fire is sort of outlined by black soot, but where the fire was hottest and most intense, it's completely white. All right, any soot has burned off. And I don't know if you can see or not, but inside the bake oven, the brick walls are starting to brighten. So we're getting close with our bake oven. All right, so that's one way. If the oven has brightened, it's probably getting hot enough. Other methods involve things as simple as throwing in a handful of flour onto the floor of the bake oven. And depending on what happens with the flour, does it instantly burn? Then your oven's too hot. If it slowly browns, it's not hot enough. But if it browns within a set period of time, and again, the housekeeper knows what this is, then it's the right temperature. You're ready to go. There's another term that's used here is when your oven is sparkling. And that also refers to throwing in the flour and seeing how quickly it burns off. Then the other method is to actually stick your arm in the oven and see how long you can hold it in there. If you can count up to 20, it's probably hot enough. If you can count past that, it's not hot enough. And if you have to yank your arm out after counting 10, it's too hot. You need to let it cool down. So these are these very interesting ways of determining whether your oven is ready or not. And again, a lot of it depends on the expertise of the housewife. You know, she develops an experience base when she can tell, yes, it's hot enough. Okay? When the oven is at its hottest, food which today would be baked at a high temperature, something between 400 and 500 degrees, such as cookies, biscuits, bread, that's what goes in first. And you're also going to put in the things that would take the longest to bake towards the back of the oven, because you want to minimize how often you're opening and closing the bake oven door and how often you have to move things around. When the oven has cooled somewhat to medium, today it would be maybe around 350 degrees, then you can put in things such as cakes, things of that sort that take a medium oven. Over the course of the day, the oven will continue to release heat. When it starts to cool down, but it's still pretty warm, and this is what's called a slack oven. A slack oven is used for foods that might bake at a low temperature for many hours. Maybe something like an Indian pudding or a crock of beans or something like that. Think in terms of what you might put today in a crock pot. That would be a slack oven for many hours, maybe even overnight.
Yep.
If you've been to a brick oven pizzeria, and obviously they're baking in a brick oven, but they keep the fire going all the time. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're baking all day or all night long. And also because pizzas bake at a pretty high temperature, so they need to keep the temperature up. We're not doing that. We're going to bake our bread, and then if we were good colonial housewives, we'd be baking maybe some cake or something else that the family might want. We're trying to get out as much of the embers and coals as we can. That may be good enough. Wow, that's hot. Yeah, that's a hot one. So we're going to close the oven and let it soak. For a few minutes, and typically you would then use something to sweep out the dust, the final ashes. And it could be, I read accounts of using a dried turkey wing, a hemlock bough, maybe even a bundle of rags on a stick, just to sort of swipe it out. We have a little broom that we're going to give it a shot and hope we don't set the broom on fire. You can bake the bread right on the coals. Because we have ours in these pans, we're going to put the pans on trivets and push it to the rear. Edge we hit every time. Okay, our bread is in. Oh, gotta put the little guy in. A little experimental little guy.
Why not?
Why not? Waste not, want not. There. Little guy. There you go. Alright. So now we close it up and let it bake. So, it's the moment of truth. The bake oven, or the bread, has been in there for a good hour.
Yeah.
So we're going to see how it is. Way back in there. It smells like bread.
Aha! Half the battle.
Loaf number one. There's bread number two. proper sound to it. And it smells delish. That was hot. Come back. Okay. Well, this one's a little browner around the edges than that one is, which might have something to do with the heat in the oven not being even. So we'll let that cool off a little bit, and then we'll slice into it. All right, so we've let our bread cool for a little bit, and so now we're going to cut into it and see what we see. It's nice and crusty. So, a little doughy in the middle.
Okay.
Not as doughy as the others, but cornmeal definitely gives it a texture. Okay, Nancy, you have to try it too.
All right. Oh, I like.
Okay, so ready?
Ready.
Fire. All right, so we've let our bread cool for a little bit, and so now we're going to cut into it and see what we see. It's nice and crusty. So, a little doughy in the middle.
Okay.
Not as doughy as the others, but don't put this in the video.
Here's a good hearty peasant bread.
Yeah. Cornmeal definitely gives it a texture. Okay, Nancy, you have to try it too.